Good morning, everyone. Welcome to your second lesson, revision lesson on America. Today we're going to look at the bust. Last lesson you were with Miss Slater and you were looking at the economic boom. Today's lesson I'm going to keep as short as possible. It is important that you watch all the way until the end. This is kind of a vital piece of revision for you in the build up to you getting back into school. And working towards those exams that are, still the most important thing to us at the moment. For this session, like last session, all you need is a pen and a paper. If you wanted to, you could watch this on your phone and just complete the work on pen and paper if you want. I'm not going to give you essay questions on this because we're going to be, going through the slides and you're going to be writing notes. So it's important that you keep up with the video. If you're struggling, pause the video, complete the work and move on. At the end of this session, you should have a full set of notes on the bust. Now these notes are important, as I've already said, because you will need these notes for your end of year assessment in year 11. You also need it for your end of year assessment in year 9, 10 and all the way through to year 11. So please make sure you keep these safe. Also remember, this video is going to stay live, so you might be watching this a few years down the line when you're getting ready for your GCSEs. If so, welcome, but please make sure you're watching the whole video, stopping the video when I'm telling you to, and writing in as much detail as possible. So let's make a start, shall we? Today, I've already said we're looking at the bust. You can see by the picture that we're looking at the bust. But before we start, I just want you to look at the question on the slide. It says, think back to your last session, and think of 4 words to describe the boom of the previous decade. So I just want you to pause the video here, maybe give yourself 3 minutes, and I want you to think of 4 words that describe the previous decade. An example of that could be something like flappers, prohibition, racial tension, whatever it is. There are lots of different words. What key words do you think clarify the previous decade? 2 minutes. Okay, welcome back. So if you've included words about hire purchase, about the assembly line, talked about farmers and agriculture struggles, if you talked about the middle class, upper class, excellent. If you've talked about Sacco and Vanzetti, Red Scare, that's also excellent. There is so much you can use to describe the previous decade. So well done for completing that. Now, I've chosen this image because this image shows a kind of a turning point in the decade that we're about to look at. Obviously, the bust is the complete collapse of the American economy, the end of frivolous spending, the end of the party decade, and the man in the picture is not Teddy Roosevelt, it's FDR Roosevelt, apologies. So FDR Roosevelt is there, and he has rolled up his sleeves. He has put all of the previous issues, the previous policies of the last president in a trash can, and he is taking out the trash. Okay. Now you might notice it says prosperity is just around the corner. That's one thing in his dustbin, and that is a throwback or a shout out to Hoover, because that policy didn't work. So this is a nice image to symbolize the New Deal that Roosevelt brings in. Now, something you've already studied, but Roosevelt comes in 1930s, in 1933, and completely changes the government's response to the Depression. And in doing so, he, in effect, takes out the trash of the previous president and he gets America working again. So, we've completed our little throwback to last lesson. Now we're going to look at this lesson. Now, what I've done is I've put a video in the description box to this video. And what I want you to do is I want you to watch it so you can write bust as a spider diagram. And as you watch it, I want you to make notes and summarize what's going on in this decade. So pause the video here, go find the video, and then come back to me when you're done. Okay, so let's get straight into it. Next couple of slides, we're going to read the information. I'm going to go through the information with you, and then there's a simple question for you to answer in your book. If you'd like to write notes as I'm talking, that's absolutely fine as well. So, the first thing we need to look at is the Wall Street crash. And this happens in 1929. In October 1929, the boom of the Roaring Twenties ended with a huge stock market crash. This was the beginning of what would become an economic depression. So, a stock market is where shares for public companies are traded. So, the shares in a public company will be traded and they will have a particular value. And if that value drops significantly, then people lose huge amounts of money. Now, that is a layman's terms of what happens. If you look in the boxes below, it will cover in more information, and we're going to read through those boxes. As we go through this slide, the two things I'm going to get you to do is to write a definition for the Great Depression and the Wall Street crash. And straight away, there is a description of the depression in this box. It says a depression is when an economy collapses, causing high unemployment, difficulty in getting credit, people buying far less, and far fewer jobs being produced. So people lose their jobs because they don't have any money, they can't buy more things. That means that fewer goods are produced, and that means factories will probably lay off more workers, which will lead to a spiral. Okay, so it's a circle in which each action affects the next one. So what was the Wall Street crash then? So you can be writing your definition for depression, and you can be working on your definition for the Wall Street crash. So throughout the 1920s, the American economy had been booming. Millions of people had bought shares, often with borrowed money. During the boom, there was a huge demand for luxury goods such as cars, radios, and fridges, but by 1929, nearly everyone who could afford them had bought them, and more were being made than they could. So that's overproduction. So if you've sold a fridge to everyone who's got the money to do it, then if you continue to manufacture fridges, you have no one to sell them to. So it means that you have more fridges sitting around not being sold. Foreign governments had put high taxes on American products, often as payback for American import taxes, so the extra goods could not be sold elsewhere. So that's overproduction of fridges. They can't sell them to any more American people, but also they're struggling to sell them to Europe because America had put high tariffs on imports from Europe, so Europe had done the same thing, and that means that in Europe it wasn't actually cheap to buy American goods, they were a lot more expensive. Company profits started to dip, and a few people began to sell their shares because they were worried that they wouldn't get a dividend. So because profits of companies are starting to shrink, people start selling shares. As more companies began to look less profitable, more people sold their shares. The share prices began to fall. This led to panic as people scrambled to sell shares before the price dropped further. So there was this really, there's big panic about having to sell as many shares as you could, and that drove the price even lower. So say a share in a company was £10 a share. If everyone's trying to sell their shares at the same time, then people are going to pay less for them. And what that means is that money is going to be lost. So a share that was previously worth £10 now being sold for £5, it means that you on one share have lost £5. Now, if you own a million shares, okay, then previously they were worth $10 million. Now they're worth $5 million. So you can see how the more shares people have, the more affected they're going to be by this. A small amount isn't that significant, but when you get to these big numbers, people losing huge amounts of money, then it's a major issue. On the 24th of October 1929, 13 million shares were sold on the New York Stock Exchange, 5 times as many as usual. Share prices fell dramatically. This became known as Black Thursday, and another 16 million shares were sold on 29th of October. So in the Wall Street crash, America's shares lost billions of dollars. So they lost 89% in their value. So this money almost disappears. The price of a share is cut, so people lose huge amounts of money on those shares. If people have a lot of money invested, they're expecting to at least make their money back and make profit. But if they get 10% of a return on their shares, then they've lost 90% of the money that they have invested. Now, obviously, that means that companies' profits are down. People are losing huge amounts of money on the stock market. This is mainly the middle class who are floating their money on it. And that's going to lead to further issues. So what I want you to do is I want you to just pause the video there if you need to and finish your definition for both the depression and the Wall Street crash. It's also important to note that the Wall Street as a stock exchange is also connected to other countries' stock exchanges. America had issued huge amounts of loans to other countries at the end of World War I and would now be recalling those loans to help boost its own economy. So this isn't just contained to America. This depression is felt across Europe as well. So why did falling share prices cause a depression? So many people borrowed money to buy shares. When the price collapsed, they couldn't repay their loans. The banks had also invested money in shares. So that's pretty much what banks do. Banks, they keep your money in a safe place. So if I have got £50 and I take it to my local bank, I can put it in my bank account. I can have access to it through my bank card, but that is safe. If I kept £50 in my house, then someone could break into my house and take my £50. But if it's in a bank, that money is covered by the bank. If they are robbed, then my money is still safe. Now, what banks do with your money when it put into the bank account is they use it to invest. They use it to invest in different money-making things. And what you get as a result of that is interest. Now, the interest is normally very low. It might be below 1%. But if you notice in your bank account at the end of a year, for example, you might, depending on how much money you've got in, you might earn £1 or you might earn £2 or more. Now, that is interest because the bank is buying shares in companies, it's investing the money. Now, when the stock market collapses, these banks lose huge amounts of money, and some of these banks don't have enough money to cover the savings of the people who have accounts with them. So banks fail. If a bank doesn't have enough money to give everyone back their money they've put in, then it collapses. So the stock market crash caused banks to fail. More than 600 banks closed in 1929. 600 banks, that's a huge amount. The people who put their life savings in the banks lost everything. Hundreds of thousands of people and businesses lost everything. This caused panic as people rushed to take their money out of the banks and caused more banks to fail. The banks that were left were very reluctant to lend money in case people borrowing it couldn't repay their loans, so it became harder to borrow. Many businesses had to close, which meant many people lost their jobs. So it's not just people losing their savings, it's also businesses going out of business because they don't have enough money. They don't have a loan coming in to support them. Maybe the owner of the business lost huge amounts of money in the stock market as well, and that puts more pressure on the system because you're making more people unemployed. Unemployment meant that people had less money to spend, making it hard for them to buy food and pay rent. So it's no longer even thinking about the luxury consumer items, it's about survival, and a lot of people don't even have enough money to survive with food and rent. So there's just a brief kind of a bit more detail on how banks work. So the two functions, savings and loans, please read through those will help you. The crash stopped banks working because when people removed their savings, the bank could no longer use the money to make loans. Other people could not repay their loans, so the banks ran out of money. What I want you to do is I just want you to pause the video here and answer this question. Describe two effects of the Wall Street crash. So you could talk about savings and banks. Those are the two I talk about. So maybe a sentence on savings, people's savings, and a statement on banks. You could also talk about unemployment as well. But just quickly pause the video here and describe two effects of the Wall Street crash. Okay, let's keep going then. So how did the Great Depression affect American society? So what we're going to do is over the next 2 slides, I'm going to show you the impact it had on farmers, business owners, and unemployed. So what I'd like you to do, and the first question is going to be how was each group affected? You can write business owners, unemployed, and farmers, and as we go through these, you can just write down a few bullet points. So let's start with business owners. Banks had lent billions of dollars during the 1920s. Many borrowers couldn't pay it back, so banks went bankrupt. Banks were reluctant to lend money, making it harder for businesses to keep functioning. Between 1929 and 32, industrial production fell by nearly 45%. Business profits dropped from 10 billion in 1929 to 1 billion in 1932. That's a significant drop in terms of profits. During the crash, demand for goods fell away even more, meaning that businesses failed and factories closed. So for business owners, they're suffering from collapse in their own businesses, having to shut them down, a huge loss in the profit they're making as well. The richest people in the country, however, lost money in the Depression, but they still had lots of money left. Okay, so the people at the very top, the richest in America, although they lost huge amounts of money, they actually still had a lot of money left over. But they had to cut back on spending, and that normally meant a sacking of staff. And in 1930s, the first people to go were the people who weren't white and male. So the African Americans, the immigrants, these people were the people that were let go first from their jobs. Let's have a look at unemployment then. So factories struggled and many eventually closed, leaving workers without jobs. Businesses supplying factories with raw materials such as steel, timber, textiles, rubber and leather also suffered, causing more factory closures and unemployment. So if your company, your factory, puts together belts for men, if you can't get your hand on the metal for the buckle and you can't get your hand on the leather straps, then you're not going to be able to build your belts. Your factory's going to have to collapse. So not being able to get the materials is also an issue. Workers no longer use restaurants, shops and businesses near the factory, so these businesses began to struggle. So just like today, we're being told to stay at home, and we're not allowed to go to restaurants and we're not allowed to go to shops. What it means is that some of these businesses will struggle. Luckily, we have a government that is helping support these businesses. But in America, if these restaurants are failing, if these shops are failing, then the American government is going to allow them to fail. In 1929, about 3% of Americans were unemployed. By 1932, 20,000 companies had gone out of business. 13 million people, or about 25% of the workforce, were unemployed. So 25% of the American workforce became unemployed during this time. 34 million people were in families with no full-time wage earner. In some industrial cities, such as the car-making town of Toledo, Ohio, there was 80% employment. That's really significant, 80% of employment in certain areas. To make matters worse, the closure of the banks meant that about 9 million people lost their life savings, so they had nothing to fall back on. So not only were people made unemployed, but they also didn't have any savings. If people are made unemployed today, then they'd be in a good position if they had some savings to keep them going until they could find another job. But if you have no savings and no income, then you are going to struggle to pay your rent. You're going to struggle to feed yourself, which is the position a lot of these Americans found themselves in. So if you're still making notes on these, please pause the video here and finish your notes. If you finish, turn over with me and we'll look at the farmers. So during the boom, farmers had borrowed money to buy new machinery. The new machinery meant they produced more food than they could sell, so food prices dropped. So farmers are sitting on a huge kind of stockpile of food that they're unable to sell. They've actually made too much food that they can sell. So what that means is that the price of that food will go down and they will make less profit. Struggling banks started demanding their farmers pay back their loans in full. Some can no longer afford to repay their debts and had to sack workers or sell their farms. So because the banks needed the loans payments and the farmers couldn't make them, many farmers lost their farms or had to sack their workers. Rising unemployment and poverty meant that demand for food fell further. Over 1 million families lost their farms between 1930 and 34. Those who kept their land then had to struggle with drought. In the Midwest and southern plains, hot, dry weather combined with strong winds meant that millions of acres of topsoil were blown away, creating a dust bowl where crops could not grow. Many farmers abandoned their farms and moved away to try to find work. Most worked as labourers on other people's farms. Many homeless people ended up in camps where they built houses from scrap materials. We remember these as Hoovervilles, named after President Hoover, who people didn't believe was helping. Charity set up kind of soup kitchens to help people. By 1933, 60% of Americans were categorized as poor by the government. So, how was each group affected by the Depression? We've looked at business owners, the unemployed, and farmers. So you need to make sure you've got notes for each one of those. And then what I want you to do is I just want you to spend maybe 3 minutes telling me which group you think was the most badly affected and why. Now, there isn't necessarily a right or wrong answer here. What I'm looking for is your description and your explanation. So you need to use specific facts to support the argument that you are arguing, and you need to use the word because to help add weight to your answer. Pause the video here for 5 minutes to complete this task. Okay, so we're going to look at this man here, Herbert Hoover. Now, Herbert Hoover, you may remember, is the do-nothing president, the president that people in America did not like. He was the president that, because of his policies, many people were forced out of their homes and into shanty towns, which were then referred to as Hoovervilles. He believed in something called rugged individualism, which meant that his response to the Depression did not help the people who needed it the most. He believed that the American people, if they were struggling, the only way to get out of that struggle was to work hard. But he didn't realise the full extent of this depression. Hoover's administration did try to solve the problems in the country's economy, but he believed in laissez-faire or limited amount of intervention. He encouraged businesses to keep wages high to increase the amount of available buying goods. However, by 1931, they had no choice but to cut wages. He introduced a 2-cent tax on bank checks to raise extra money for the government. People stopped using checks and started using cash instead. Banks had already closed due to cash shortages, but the reaction to the tax rapidly increased the rate of bank closures. He introduced a $100 million fund to lend farmers. However, this was only a drop in the ocean. There was no way that was enough to help all the farmers. To combat unemployment among white Americans, he sent over 500,000 Mexicans and Mexican Americans to Mexico. So he actually deported huge amounts of people to try and keep jobs in the hands of the whites. He supported new public works projects to create unemployment for construction workers. One of the big things that has his name on it is the Hoover Dam, which was created to regulate the flow of water on the river, but also to create power. It's a hydroelectric dam, but it's a job creation scheme. It means that people can go into jobs. In June 1930, despite opposition from many economists, he introduced the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which raised tax on many imported items. The idea was to encourage people to buy American products. If imported items are more expensive, then they're going to go towards the cheaper American goods. However, economic depression spread worldwide, and many nations responded by raising tariffs on American goods. So actually, it damages American trade even more. So I want you to pause the video here, and I want you to spend 2 minutes summarising how Hoover responded to the Depression. So, Hoover's unpopularity. Hoover's belief in individualism meant that several bills were stopped. that would have provided direct relief to struggling Americans. He argued that the government could not fix the problems by spending money. In 1930, the Republicans did badly in the elections. Despite the defeat, he refused to change his policies. The American people became angry and unrest increased. Protests ranged from factory strikers to farm riots. In 1932, World War I veterans marched on Washington to receive their war pensions immediately, rather than waiting until 1945. Hoover refused and called in the military to disrupt the protests. So he was actually turning his own troops on previous troops, on the veterans. Many people thought Hoover's refusal to provide direct relief was due to indifference or heartlessness, but this was not the case. He genuinely believed in rugged individualism. What he failed to do was he failed to match the public opinion of the time. The public wanted help, they wanted the government to do something, and yet Hoover stuck to his guns. He stuck to what he believed in as a politician. He thought government intervention threatened individual freedom, and he wanted assistance to be handled on a voluntary basis. He didn't take a salary while in president throughout the Great Depression, and he donated an average of $25,000 every year to relief organisations. So although Hoover is the do-nothing president, he was a conviction politician. He believed in doing what he was doing, and he stuck to his guns. Unfortunately, he's not remembered well by history. So just 2 minutes, why was Hoover so unpopular? You can do it in bullet points if you like. Okay, so we're going to move on to Roosevelt now. What I'd like you to do is I'd like you to read what's on the slide. It's all about Franklin Roosevelt, and I'd like you to write a fact file for Roosevelt. So if you pause the video here, read the information. If you look in the description to this video, the second video down will also prompt you to a video on Roosevelt. You can watch the whole thing, it's about 4 minutes long, and then come back to the video for me. So just spend 4 minutes completing a fact file on Roosevelt. Okay, so this is Hoover's laissez-faire approach versus Roosevelt's New Deal. And what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to focus on Roosevelt's New Deal here, and I'd like you to just write me a definition for the word, the New Deal. Now, the New Deal was focused on meeting the needs of the people affected by the Depression. So it was a series of intervention policies to help the people that needed it the most. And if you can get the 3 R's down, that's the most important thing. So the 3 R's are relief, recovery, and reform. And this is what you're going to be tested on in your exam. You need to remember these 3 things. When you think about the New Deal, it's relief, recovery, reform. So relief is help for the unemployment, homeless, elderly, and sick by providing money and temporary work. So relieving the people that are struggling the most, giving them something to keep them going. The second one is recovery, creating jobs by spending on large government schemes such as schools and roads. So creating jobs to help the economy recover. And the last one is reform, permanently changing the structures of the banking structures, the government structures, to make sure that this never happens again. So relief, recovery, reform, helping, relieving the most poor, recovering the economy, and reforming the system so this never happens again. You can just pause the video there to finish your definition of the New Deal for me. So, the election happens in 1932, and it is an absolute landslide. Roosevelt wins. He wins 42 out of the 48 states. So, of the 48 states of America, Roosevelt wins in 42 of them. It's one of the most significant landslide victories in American political history. So why did he win though? And that's what we're going to do. So I'd like you to summarize 3 bullet points why Roosevelt won the election in 1932. Just 3. There are 6 on the page in front of you, so you can pick 3 and write them down, or you can summarize some of them into just a very short sentence. One of the big ones is how unpopular Hoover was, the do-nothing president. Historians think Roosevelt's reaching high office while managing a severe disability showed he had personality to persevere through challenges, although that disability was kept from the people. You've watched the video, you know that he had polio, which was kept him in a wheelchair. He had to wear leg braces when he went on television to show the people that he, to hide from the people that he was bound to a wheelchair. Roosevelt was a very gifted public speaker whom audience warmed to, and Hoover really disliked public speaking. His campaign really showed that. So Roosevelt took his train out. He was making 15 speeches a day across the country, whereas Hoover did very few speeches. And actually, during some of those speeches, he was met by crowds of very hostile people who would throw things at him. His campaign was heard everywhere, though. Roosevelt had the publicity of the time. Hoover had increased enforcement of prohibition. In contrast, Roosevelt promised to end prohibition, a promise that was very popular. So ending the banning of alcohol seemed to be a winner for Roosevelt. Hoover trying to keep it enforced. We've learned that there was mass corruption, lots of money being pumped into it, and very little result. The New Deal offered by Roosevelt was popular with voters. Many felt that Hoover was out of touch or uncaring. So the New Deal was seen as the future of American politics, and people wanted to get out of this depression. So reasons why Roosevelt's victory: Roosevelt seemed to have answers for the Great Depression, whereas Hoover just kept saying that prosperity is just around the corner and didn't actually promise anything. Now Roosevelt was very clever actually. Roosevelt didn't give too much information away. He never said exactly what his New Deal included, but he said that he had one, and that's what captured the American public and their support. So just finish this off, and then we'll be ready to move on. So Roosevelt gets into power, and his first 100 days are seen as incredibly significant. Roosevelt kept his promise. When he took office in March 1933, he had 3 main actions, and he had 3 main problems. He wanted to restore people's trust in the banks, he wanted to find money to help the unemployed, and he wanted to end prohibition. So in terms of the banks, over 5,000 banks had closed during the Depression. Millions had lost their savings, so people didn't trust their banks, so they weren't putting any money in them. But if the banks had no money in them, then they couldn't lend money to people wanting to start a business. So what Roosevelt did, the solution was to close all the banks with the Emergency Banking Act of 1933. He closed them for 4 days. They were inspected to make sure that they were well run, honest and solvent. They had enough money to operate, and only those that passed the test could be reopened. So what that means is the government is putting its official stamp saying, yeah, this is a bank that we've rigorously checked for 4 days, and we're opening it back up. You should trust it, and you should put your money into this bank. And it worked, because $1 billion was paid into bank accounts when the banks opened. So people trusted the government, they trusted Roosevelt, and they supported him by putting their money back into the banks. His second problem was the unemployed. Roosevelt needed to take immediate action to help unemployment, so he set up the Economy Act of 1933. It cut pay for people working for the government and armed forces by 15%. It made $1 billion available to the New Deal, which is really significant. And finally, with the Beer Act of 1933, he made it illegal to buy and sell alcohol again. And although it didn't end organised crime, it reduced the power of the gangs. It created jobs, and also, they could tax alcohol, so it made them more money. So I want you to summarise each problem in 2 bullet points. So the banks, unemployment, and prohibition. Pause the video here for 3 minutes, 2 bullet points on each of those problems. Okay, so what did Roosevelt use to solve the New Deal, or to solve the Great Depression? He used alphabet agencies. So what I want you to do is, as we go through this slide, I want you to write down a definition for alphabet agencies, the AAA, which is here, the NRA, which is here, and the FERA. Okay, so you just need to write 4 sentences, 4 definitions for each of these words. So alphabet agencies, Roosevelt knew that getting America out of depression would be hard and that he didn't know exactly what to do. He recruited lots of expert advisors and he started over 100 new organizations to tackle different problems. These new organizations were known by their initials. So there were 100 new organizations to tackle different problems. There were so many of them that they were just referred to by their initials. And that's why they're nicknamed the alphabet agencies. So I'm going to give you 3 examples, and these 3 examples I'm asking you to write definitions for. But the alphabet agencies are just organizations set up to solve the problems of the Great Depression. So the AAA affected farmers. It was the Agricultural Adjustment Agency, and it paid farmers to produce less, which led to raised prices and better incomes for farmers. So if a farmer had 3 fields of crops, it would be paid money to not plant one of those fields. So instead of providing or sort of making 3 fields of crops, it might make 2 fields of crops or just 1 field of crops. It would be able to sell them for a higher price, and it wouldn't lose money, too much money, because the government would pay that farmer to not farm some of that land. The NRA, or the National Recovery Administration, was set up to help industry. It encouraged workers and employers to agree fair wages and conditions and gave workers the rights to join trade unions. So now workers can join trade unions. Trade unions look after worker rights, which is really important. So workers feel more supported. They feel like they've got backup, and they are allowed to negotiate their working conditions better. So to help unemployment, the government set up the FERA, which is the Federal Emergency Relief Agency, and it gave $500 million to states to provide the help to homeless and malnourished by funding soup kitchens, blankets, and clothes. It also provided childcare so parents could find work. So we've got a bit of a lot of recovery going on here. Please pause the video to just finish off those definitions for me. Okay, we're close to the end now. What I'd like you to do is I'd like you to focus on this, the fireside chat section. Don't worry about priming the pump too much. But fireside chats, I just want you to write a definition for fireside chats for me. So Roosevelt's made great use of the radio as a form of communication. So many people had radios on their mantelpieces or in their living rooms, and before the age of television, people would listen to the radio, and Roosevelt would go on the radio and he would explain his policies. He would reach out into the living rooms of the American people and he would make them feel good about his policies. The first was about the banking crisis and was made 8 days into his presidency. The broadcasts were in the evening and they were clear and conversational. Roosevelt called them his fireside chats and he made him very popular. So he made people feel more comfortable with his policies by going into their living rooms via the radio and sharing what he was doing. He wanted to he wanted people to know what it was that he was doing. He didn't want to be just doing things for them and them not to understand. This is the last section. Okay, so we're just going to look at opposition very quickly. I'd like you to write a subheading, opposition to the New Deal. And we're going to look at 4 different groups, and like we did previously, you need to write down a few bullet points about each group, and then at the end we're going to talk about who was the biggest threat to the New Deal. So it's important that not everyone was in favour of the New Deal. Some believed that people should look after themselves, and one of the groups that didn't like it was the rich. Roosevelt funded the New Deal by increasing taxes on the wealthy, and many of them did not like it. They thought the government was wasting money by paying people to plant trees and paint buildings. They also felt they had lost money. Many had lost a lot of money in the Wall Street crash. Roosevelt understood this, but said they had something left, so should help those who had nothing. Many business owners resented the way Roosevelt's policies interfered with business. For For example, increasing workers' rights by setting minimum wages and maximum work hours. So the rich did not like the New Deal because they were being taxed more heavily to help fund the New Deal, and also their workers had more rights. They were arguing for better wages and to change their working hours. So they didn't like it because it was taking power away from them and it was taking money away from them. Let's have a look at another group. The political opposition, the Republicans. Now we know the Republicans believed in laissez-faire. They believed in not spending, lots of money. They believed in people looking after themselves. So Republicans like Hoover believed people should solve their own problems. They didn't like the New Deal because it was having too much influence in people's lives and the government was getting too powerful. They were worried about how much money they were spending. They called Roosevelt a dictator because he had obviously had his 100 days in power without opposition. But we've also got to remember that the Republicans had almost no say because of their poor election results in the 1932 election. So they were kind of marginalised, the Republicans were. Let's have a look at radical politicians. Some politicians took the opposite view. They believed that the New Deal didn't go far enough. We've got Francis Townsend wanted to bring the retirement age to 60 to make jobs for young people. Charles Coughlin was the National Union of Social Justice. He said that Roosevelt should do more to create jobs and ensure higher wages for workers. We've also got Huey Long, who said there should be a share our wealth policy. He believed that people with wealth over 5 million should have their wealth confiscated and it should be redistributed to other people. Now this was an idea that was more in line with socialism and a kind of more communism. So it was unpopular, but he wanted, every house to have a car, a house, a radio, free education, cheap food for the poor. And these ideas were very popular with the working class. But again, as a radical, how much sway did he actually have? The people had voted, in huge numbers for Roosevelt, so this wasn't really too much of a challenge. Now, what I'd say is the biggest challenge came with the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is America's highest court. When a law gets passed, it then goes to the Supreme Court, and they check whether it's constitutional. So after the American independence, in America they have a constitution, which is kind of a legal document of all the rights of Americans that can't be taken away. Things like the right to bear arms, the right to free speech. So when a law gets passed, it goes to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court decide whether that law is constitutional, and at that stage they can actually overturn a decision that's been made by the president, a decision that's gone through the House of Representatives. So according to the Constitution, the president can make laws affecting the whole country, and individual states' government decide on laws for their own states. In 1935, the Supreme Court decided that the Agricultural Adjustments Agency was unconstitutional, because it took away states' rights to decide that what money to give farmers. It also said that some of these measures introduced by the National Recovery Administration were illegal for the same reason. So what's happening here is the Supreme Court have actually overturned a decision that's gone through the House. They've overruled a decision that's been made by the president. So this group can actually overturn a decision made by the president. Now, obviously the president didn't like the Supreme Court doing this, so he threatened to get rid of some of the Supreme Court and replace them with Democrats, people that would support him. It was at this point where they decided that for the greater good, to keep Democrats away from the Supreme Court, that they would accept policies but continue to hold the government to account. So although the Supreme Court didn't have the power to, they backed down over this issue, there is a possibility that they could have stopped and caused more problems for the sitting president. Any opposition is kind of highlighted by the fact that Roosevelt won the 1936 election easily. Even though the Republicans chose a popular politician, this was because although the people who opposed Roosevelt's policies were vocal, the majority of American people benefited from the New Deal, so they weren't going to get rid of their president. So the last thing I want you to do is tell me how each group opposed the New Deal and which provided the biggest challenge. I think I've answered that. It's the Supreme Court, but tell me why the Supreme Court was the biggest challenge. Thank you very much for your hard work listening to this today. It's important that you keep going with your revision. It's important that you keep these notes. You will be using these notes. You probably will be using this video again before your time is finished. So keep up the hard work, and thank you very much for listening. There is going to be a quiz coming later on in the week, so do look out for that. And again, go back through the video if you need it. Talk to your teachers, and we're here to help you. All right, thank you very much. Have a good week, everyone.